I held the night rotation at Outpost Halvin's Reach for 11 years before that watch, and in all that time the board had given me 4 genuine alarms. 3 were debris shed from the old mining hulks that drifted the border like the bones of something that died slowly. The 4th was a Korathi raider, a single ship, that crossed the marker buoys, looked at what we had waiting for it, and turned back into the dark without firing a shot. That was the closest thing to excitement Halvin's Reach had offered in a decade, and I had told the story of it so many times that even I no longer believed it had been frightening. The Reach itself was an old asteroid, hollowed and braced and strung with sensor spines, until it looked less like a rock and more like 40 years' worth of antenna farm with a crew. Quarters bolted on as an afterthought. My own quarters had a window the size of a dinner plate, and on a clear watch I could angle my second pair of eyes toward it without lifting my head from the board. A small luxury, the kind of Halven learns to value after enough years, pressed into a station this size with 5 other species and their 5 different ideas of acceptable temperature. Below us, 11 hours by shuttle, sat Corvain's Hold. A tide-locked world, half of it permanent dusk. 2.5 million people lived in cities, built into the twilight band, because the sunward face was an oven, and the dark face was a tomb. The Hold had been a compact world for 3 centuries. It had also been, for most of those 3 centuries, the forward edge of a war that never quite ended and never quite began again. The long grinding pressure of the Korathi remnant against a border that the Halvene Compact, a coalition of 6 small species who had banded together because none of us alone could hold a line, had been quietly losing for longer than anyone wanted to admit out loud. So I was tired, and the board was quiet, and at 0340 station time something came over the heliopause marker at a velocity my console refused to display as a number. It gave me a string of dashes instead. I tapped the panel the way you tap an old instrument that has stuck before, and the dashes resolved into a figure. And I sat looking at that figure for 4 full seconds before I understood that the console was not malfunctioning. The object had crossed the outer marker 50 light minutes out, and in the time it took me to blink, it was already inside the system, decelerating from a velocity that put it, for one impossible instant, ahead of the light that should have been carrying news of its own arrival. The classification engine did what it was built to do. It looked at an object the size of a frigate, moving faster than any drive we had ever measured, on a vector that threaded the outer relay stations and ran straight down the gravity well toward Corvain's Hold, and it called it the only thing it had a category for: a kinetic strike, a planet killer. The Korathi had tried slower versions of the same thing twice in my lifetime, mass-driven rocks accelerated over years, and aimed at a colony, and we had learned to watch for them. This board had never seen one move like that. Nothing had. The alarm went out to every station on the line before I had finished reading the threat assessment. Not because the system does not wait for a sensor technician to feel anything about what she is looking at. Within 90 seconds, Corvain's Hold's planetary grid went to maximum alert. I watched the population displays. I had access to civil feeds. We all did. It was part of the job. And I watched the evacuation on klaxons light up city after city in the twilight band. Families being walked at a run toward the deep shelters they had dug during my grandmother's war, and never had cause to use. I watched orbital defense platforms bring 60 years of accumulated weaponry to bear on a single incoming point, every battery in the system, converging its targeting solution on the same coordinates. Because if this was what it looked like, there would be no second chance to be right. And then, at a range where the math said there should have been nothing left to do but watch, the object stopped. Not slowed, stopped. The deceleration curve on my display did not taper. It simply ended in under 2 seconds, from a velocity that should have required an engine flare, bright enough to blind every sensor on the Reach. And there was no flare. There was no debris cloud from a Drave core itself apart under that kind of load, which is what should have happened, is what would have happened to anything we had ever built. There was just a sudden, total absence of motion, hanging in high orbit over Corvain's Hold, where an instant before there had been a weapon with no name. It took the optical arrays another 4 seconds to resolve a shape. Because nobody had thought to point a telescope at where a kill vehicle would have been, there would have been nothing left to look at. What we got finally, on every screen in the Reach and on the tactical net end, I have no doubt on every targeting display in the system, was a ship. Small, wedge-shaped, dark-hulled, riding alone with its running lights on, sitting motionless in the crosshairs of an entire planetary defense grid that had, in the space of perhaps 11 seconds, gone from tracking a planet killer to staring at something that had simply arrived and was now, very calmly, doing nothing at all. Nobody fired. I want to be honest about why. It was not restraint, not at first. It was that nobody could process fast enough to give the order, and by the time anyone could have, the thing that had terrified us had already stopped being a threat in any shape we recognized, and was instead just sitting there, lights on, waiting, while 60 batteries kept their locks and 40,000 hands stayed on triggers and nothing happened. The transmission came 11 seconds later on the old emergency band, in halting but correct compact trade tongue, slow enough that you could hear the words being chosen. This is the Courier Scout Verge Light, Terran Survey and Relief Corps. Sorry for the alarm. We know how that looked. We are not armed for what your boards just called us, and we are not going to move until someone tells us it's safe to. Please stand down your platforms. We can wait as long as you need. I have read that transcript perhaps 200 times since, and the thing that still catches me is, we know how that looked. An explanation first, not a demand. An apology for the fear, offered by something that had just crossed 50 light minutes in less time than it took our own warning to reach the world it had been aimed at. Because that was the truth of it, we worked out afterward. The Verge Light had ridden in so close behind its own arrival that the alert I sent down to Corvain's hold, the order that put 2.5 million people into shelters, reached the surface after the ship that had triggered it was already sitting, motionless in their sky. The warning arrived after the ship. For one whole minute, the people of the hold ran for shelter from a weapon that had already stopped being anything at all, and become, instead, first thing of its kind any of us had ever seen. It took the Compact Defense Council 19 minutes to give the stand-down order, and I have never blamed them for those 19 minutes. What I remember is that the Verge Light did not move once, not a meter, the entire time. No defensive maneuvering, no power spike, nothing that could be read as readying for a fight it had not started. It simply held position, lights on, while we decided whether to trust it, and somewhere in those 19 minutes the pilot, a human, we learned later, alone aboard, a surveyor named Reyes, who had been 3 years subjective and 11 years objective in transit, running ahead of a relief convoy still decades out, because their long-range listening posts had picked up our old distressed broadcasts about the frothy pressure, and someone, somewhere on a world I have still never seen, had decided that someone should come and tell us help was coming, even if the help itself was still far behind. Somewhere in those 19 minutes, Reyes said one more thing on the open channel, to no one in particular, while the gun stayed locked on the hull. "Take your time," she said. "We're not going anywhere. I have stood that watch through 40 years of alarms, 3 of them real, before and since. I have seen weapons fired and weapons withheld, and I have written more incident reports than I can count. But I have never again seen, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, a thing that an entire world had aimed every gun it owned at. Simply choose quietly not to be afraid of us instead.